Good afternoon and welcome to our presentation providing guidance on the Type 1 categorical exclusion process provided by the Florida Department of Transportation, Office of Environmental Management. My name is Harrison Garrett. I am a project delivery coordinator with OEM, and our presenter today is going to be Christine Haddock, who is an in-house consultant for OEM from Stantec. Christine, next slide, please. All right, so for some housekeeping, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the FDOT website to allow others who wanted to attend but couldn't participate at their convenience. During the webinar, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in our question box. Our team will monitor those questions as they come in and we'll address them at the end of this training. And without further ado, Christine.
Thank you, Harrison. Today, our training includes 5 lessons. In lesson 1, we're going to explain what a categorical exclusion is. In lesson 2, we'll get more specific and define a type 1 categorical exclusion. In lesson 3, we'll run through a process overview. In lesson 4, we'll go over the analysis and documentation. And then in lesson 5, we'll cover reevaluations for these projects. First, let's go over categorical exclusions in general. The National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, allows for certain types of Federal Highway Administration projects to be categorically excluded from a higher level of environmental review if the project meets certain conditions. Now, they're not excluded from NEPA, but they do not require a higher level of analysis that would be required for other NEPA documents, such as an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement. And categorical exclusions, or CEs as we're going to call them, are defined as those projects that, based on past experience with similar actions, they normally don't have a significant environmental effect. Now, CE projects must meet the criteria in Section A of 23 Code of Federal Regulations, CFR 771.117. Now, if a project meets these criteria, it basically will have no significant environmental impacts. And throughout this training, we're going to be discussing different sections of this regulation. First, Section A, as shown here, which provides the criteria to be a categorical exclusion. And then we're going to go over Sections C and D that list specific categorical exclusion types. And finally, Section E, which lists constraints. This webinar focuses on only one of 2 types of categorical exclusion documents that are prepared by FDOT. And today we're going to be covering the Type 1 categorical exclusion. First, let's go over the criteria for all CEs that are listed in Section A. And so in order for a project to be a categorical exclusion, it must be sufficiently evident that the project will not induce significant impacts to planned growth or land use for the area, require the relocation of significant numbers of people, have a significant impact on resources, including natural, cultural, recreational, historic, or other resource. It must not involve significant air noise or water quality impacts or have significant impacts on travel patterns, or either individually or cumulatively have any significant environmental impact. In lesson 2, we'll delve into what specifically a Type 1 categorical exclusion is. Type 1 CEs are prepared for non-construction activities, such as planning and research, and also as those smaller construction or repair type activities. The NEPA approval is documented in a Type 1 categorical exclusion checklist. Now, this document describes the proposed action, and then it documents that it falls within the pre-established thresholds, or the CE criteria that were listed in Section A. Now, under NEPA assignment, the CE document is approved by FDOT with no involvement from the Federal Highway Administration. Type 1 CEs can only provide documentation for project types that are included in the 23 CFR 771.117 C or D lists. Now, these are listed in Part 1, Chapter 2 of FDOT's Project Development and Environment, or PD&E manual. Note that other types of categorical exclusion used by FDOT, the other type, a type 2 CE, it qualifies for categorical exclusion, but it doesn't fall under the C or D list. And we're not going to cover that type in this training. There are 30 actions that are on the C list. A summary of these actions is included on this and the following few slides. C list actions require minimal analysis. They are pre-approved and normally don't require any further NEPA approvals by OEM. Actions 26, 27, and 28 are highlighted here as we're going to be discussing these specifically later on in this training. There's also a 10 D list actions, not including 1 through 3 here, which are reserved for future use. Now, these are the 10 D list actions. Please note that number 13 is highlighted. We're also going to be discussing this action when we go over the highlighted ones in the C list as well. Common C list actions include approval of roadside utility installations. There's construction of bicycle and pedestrian paths and lanes, the installation of pavement markings and fencing, also landscaping, resurfacing, and modernization activities such as adding shoulders or auxiliary lanes. Now, the D list includes less common activities, things such as construction of fringe parking facilities, way stations, rest areas, and approvals for changes in access control. Now, Part 1, Chapter 2 of the PD&E Manual provides a list of all the projects which qualify as the Type 1 CE. Now, as you can see here, it provides the actions that are listed in the C, D, and E of 23 CFR 771.117. If your project really seems like it should be a Type 1 CE, but it's not fitting into the usual category that a preparer might select, make sure to review all of the project types in the C and D lists. And you may also contact OEM for assistance. There are additional criteria contained in Section E for those C list actions 26, 27, and 28. Now, these actions include modernization of highway by resurfacing, restoration, rehabilitation, reconstruction, adding shoulders, or adding auxiliary lanes. Restoration, rehabilitation, or replacement of culverts and inlets, drainage pipes, and systems can be under this CE when they're done as a highway modernization. C27 is highway safety or traffic operations improvement projects. This includes the installation of ramp metering control devices and lighting. Also, the construction of new roundabouts or traffic circles are considered traffic operation improvement projects under this CE. And C28, bridge rehabilitation, reconstruction, or replacement, or the construction of grade separation to replace existing at-grade railroad crossings. Bridge removal may be a component of a bridge replacement project under the CE. Now, if those C-list projects, 26, 27, and 28, if they do not meet the 6 constraints listed under Section E, then they're going to need to be identified as a D-list number 13 rather than C-list actions and require consultation with OEM. The Section E constraints include acquisition of more than a minor amount of right-of-way or that would result in any residential or non-residential displacement, an action that needs a bridge permit from the U.S. Coast Guard, or an action that does not meet the terms and conditions of a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers nationwide or general permit. There's a finding of adverse effect to historic properties under the National Historic Preservation Act, the use of a Section 4 protected resource, except for actions resulting in de minimis impacts, or also a finding of may affect likely to adversely affect for a threatened or endangered species or critical habitat under the Endangered Species Act. Other considerations include the construction of temporary access or the closure of existing road, bridge, or ramps that would result in major traffic disruptions. Changes in access control or a floodplain encroachment other than functionally dependent uses, such as bridges or wetlands, or actions that facilitate open space use, such as recreational trails or bicycle and pedestrian paths, or construction activities that are in, across, or adjacent to a river component designated or proposed for inclusion in the National System of Wild and Scenic Rivers. Now note that if any Section E constraint is triggered, you must consult with OEM to determine if the project can proceed as a Type 1 CE under the D-List Action 13. This slide here presents an example of a project that it could have been a D-List 26 action, but it ended up being identified as a D13 action due to potential relocations. The project consists of milling, resurfacing, adding directional medians, minor drainage, lighting, and also sidewalks. So you would think it would be a C26 action. However, minor right-of-way acquisition impact an ice machine business and bring the roadway closer to a residence, as depicted by this yellow proposed right-of-way line here in the image. Relocation will therefore be offered to the residents and the business. So acquisition that would result in displacement is one of the constraints in the E-list, and it is listed as E1. The district would then consult with OEM and most likely proceed with a D-List 13 Type 1 CE. While the focus of this training is on FDOT Type 1 CEs, it should also be noted that FDOT can use CEs from other agencies, such as the Federal Transit Administration or the Federal Railroad Administration. If a CE from one of these agencies is needed, then the district must contact OEM because OEM is responsible for that coordination with FTA or FRA, and any consultation with the agency must be documented. For more information on determining whether a project can be considered a Type 1 CE, you can visit the web-based training. This is the NEPA introductory course, Categorical Exclusions. This CBT may have some slightly different definitions than today's training because of some of the recent updates to the Council on Environmental Quality Regulations. Well, that wraps up lesson 1. I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Harrison to send out a few poll questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Christine. I am pulling up our first poll question of the day, so give me one moment. All right, there it is. So our poll question for the first one is, which of the following projects may be classified as a Type 1 CE? Check all that apply. And choices are construction of a new highway facility, construction of facilities, modernization of a highway such as resurfacing, construction of new truck weigh stations or rest areas, or state-funded projects. So I'll give y'all some time and we'll come back with the results. Looks like we still got a few more rolling in, but we'll close it here in about 5 seconds. All right, thank you so much. Let's see the results. So pretty good. Looks like we have the biggest one of modernization of highways, such as resurfacing at 89%, which is one of the correct choices. Correct choices was construction of bicycle and pedestrian, construction of facilities, and then also construction of new truck waste stations or rest areas. So thank you so much, and we will move on. And of course, we've got back-to-back poll questions, so I hope nobody went anywhere. Pulling that one up for you now. And it is, which of the following are constraints listed under 23 CFR 771.117E and applied to C list 26, 27, and 28? Select all that apply. Choices are a de minimis finding for Section 4F impacts, right-of-way acquisitions resulting in displacements, US ACE nationwide permit, changes in access control, US Coast Guard bridge permit required. So I'll give everyone some time to select their answers. All right, coming near the end, give you a few more seconds to get your answers in. Perfect, looks like everybody's in. So let's go ahead and close and take a look at the results. Pretty definitive, correct. One of the right answers was right-of-way acquisitions resulting in displacements, which 81% put in. And the other answers, correct answers were changes in access control at 55% and US Coast Guard bridge permit required at 66%. Perfect, thank you everybody. And without further ado, I will hand it back over to Christine.
Thanks, Harrison. So next we'll give a high-level overview of the process for completing a Type 1 CE. The first step is to confirm that a Type 1 CE is appropriate, and then we perform analysis and coordinate with agencies as applicable. And this step is going to be covered in detail in Lesson 4. Finally, we document the results in a Type 1 categorical exclusion checklist. Here we have a figure from Part 1, Chapter 2 of the PD&E manual that guides us through the process for completing a Type 1 CE. First, the class of actions determined, typically by the district with no involvement from OEM. There are exceptions that require OEM involvement, including those C-list actions 26, 27, and 28 that trigger a constraint that we had talked about earlier. There's also some situations on the checklist that can require coordination with OEM, which we're going to discuss a little bit more here in Lesson 4. The minor categorical exclusion or MICE process is available for projects where the class of action isn't clear. And there's been a number of situations where the districts have needed to coordinate with OEM to confirm that a Type 1 CE was appropriate, or to help determine which Type 1 is the appropriate type. Now, the purpose of the MICE process is to assist the districts in supporting CE determinations and providing specific documentation to address the potential impacts to relevant information, to those relevant environmental issues or resources without causing a change in the class of action, without causing it to be elevated. And it's used for Type 1 CEs that may involve environmental impacts and require a little bit more additional analysis than would normally be necessary. And it's also used for Type 2 CEs, focusing on criteria that trigger the Type 2 and whether project conditions have changed that would allow a Type 1 CE. The next step, analysis and coordination, will be discussed in detail in Lesson 4. That the results of the analysis and coordination are documented in a Type 1 categorical exclusion checklist using the statewide environmental project tracker called SWEPT. And this checklist is prepared during the design phase, and there's no PD&E phase. A Type 1 CE is typically entered into SWEPT at the 100% plans phase. And note that a public hearing is typically not required for Type 1 CEs. The public hearings are required if the project's considered a major transportation improvement which is defined in section 339.1155B of the Florida statutes. And if the district determines that a sensitive community issue exists on or near the proposed project, then a community awareness plan, or CAP, may be prepared, recommending appropriate public involvement activities. Now, this image here displays the initial information that's entered into SWEP to start the Type 1 CE checklist. Note that when entering project information for projects that may fall under 2 or more actions, you're going to need to identify the CE designation that is the most appropriate. Detailed SWEP training materials are available on OEM's Training Track 2 website to provide guidance on creating and approving the checklist. In Lesson 4, we'll get into the details of analysis and documentation. There's a variety of means to evaluate environmental impacts for Type 1 CEs. These include GIS tools such as the Environmental Screening Tool, or EST, the Area of Interest tool, and resources from other agencies. Other tools include design plans, agency databases, and field reviews. Note that a field review, while not required, puts everything in context, and it may reveal details that are not necessarily known or mapped in those online resources. Other means include, local knowledge, the species keys, the Section 106 Programmatic Agreement, and also Programmatic Approaches for Endangered Species Act consultation. And please note, we're going to go over each topic on the checklist and which tools are most applicable. Now, impacts to certain issues or resources may require coordination with agencies to verify the finding that there's no potential to significantly impact certain resources, such as historic resources or listed species. Now, before diving into the specific topics, we'll go over FDOT's Area of Interest tool, or AOI, which is a good starting point for analysis. During the plans phase, Type 1 CEs do not present sufficient project magnitude or impacts to qualify for screening in the EST through the Environmental Transportation Decision-Making, or ETDM, process. Even though an ETDM screening is not performed, the practitioner can still use the EST's AOI tool. To use the tool, you'll need to log into the EST website and open the map viewer. You then select the AOI editor that's shown here on the screen. And you can then draw your project or study area and run reports for your area of interest. The information from the tool, the data outputs and maps, they can be used to identify resources that are present in your project area. The GIS analysis uses many databases to identify resources that are potentially present in the AOI. And most of them are publicly available through the Florida Geographic Data Library. Now, the image here at the top of the screen, it shows the types of reports that are output. You can select a report that shows all the resource analysis, or a report that's focused on one specific resource. And an example report is shown here on the bottom image. In this example, the bottom line of the report shown reveals that there are wetlands in the area of interest per the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Wetlands Inventory. Now, once you identify the resources that are potentially present in your study area, you can use the AOI tool to add those features to your AOI map. You can print the map, and you can also use it as supporting documentation in SWEP. You also can share your AOI map with others that have EST access. Now, for training on using the AOI tool, you can see the AOI tool training on OEM's training program website, and it's there in track 7. You can also use your own mapping system to identify the resource locations and overlay them with your design. And this would be necessary if you need to calculate things like impact area. Next, we will discuss each issue or resource topic on the Type 1 CE checklist. The Type 1 checklist includes the resources that are listed here. And chapters in part 2 of the PD&E manual describes how to conduct analysis, how to assess project impacts, and consult with resource agencies for each of these topics. So for each of the following resources slides, we're going to review the checklist options. We're going to review the analysis tools that are used to help you select the applicable checklist option. And we're going to discuss comments and coordination and support documentation potentially included for each of the checkboxes. And please note that these slides don't include a visual of the form in SWEPT itself, but instead they present the options that you would select on the form for discussion purposes. Now for each slide, we include some examples of supporting information for when a resource is present. And we're not going to discuss each example, and these are really just provided for easy reference material in case you want to go back and review this presentation later. The first topic is right-of-way. Right-of-way impacts are determined through reviewing the design plans and in some cases the right-of-way maps. In addition to roadway right-of-way impacts, the reviewer must consider other possible right-of-way impacts in the design, which commonly include drainage easements, pond sites, and temporary construction easements. If your project qualifies for one of the first two checkboxes, within existing right-of-way, or minor acquisition without relocation and/or displacement, then no additional coordination is required. You can provide a comment describing your case and upload a figure if appropriate. If your project does involve relocation or displacement, or an acquisition of state-owned or conservation lands subject to review and approval by the that Acquisition and Restoration Council, or ARC, then the red warning label is going to appear and OEM must be consulted. And you're going to need to contact the OEM District Project Delivery Coordinator. That would be the person of contact. While the red text for acquisitions with relocation says that the project cannot proceed as a Type 1 CE, there are cases of minor right-of-way acquisition with potential relocations that can proceed as a delist action, that delist action 13, as we previously reviewed. Now this would be those C-list classifications 26, 27, and 28. And coordination with OEM will help you determine if your project may proceed as a Type 1 CE under the delist action 13. Next, we have wetlands. The potential presence of wetlands can first be identified using those desktop tools, including the AOI tool, the National Wetlands Inventory Mapper. You can use aerial imagery or other state or local GIS data layers, such as from the city or the county GIS department. There's the Florida Geographic Data Library or the information from the Water Management District. If wetlands may be present, then a field visit should be done to confirm. And even if the desktop resources indicate wetlands aren't present, then a field visit is also still recommended to assist with filling out the checklist, because it can also help provide valuable context and the opportunity to ground truth all of the resource topics. Now, if wetlands are present, then they should be delineated and overlaid on the design plans. And if impacts are to occur, they should be quantified. If wetlands are determined to be in the project area and not included in the design plans, then this issue should be discussed with the design project manager. When there are wetland impacts, you're going to need to coordinate permit requirements with the district permit coordinator. And the permit type is selected on the form. Nationwide permits are issued by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers on a national basis, and they're designated to streamline the Department of Army authorization of projects such as commercial developments, utility lines, or road improvements that produce minimal impact to the nation's aquatic environment. A general permit is issued by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for structures, for work or discharges that will result in only minimal adverse effects. Now, general permits are issued on a regional or state basis for specific categories of activities. An individual or standard permit is issued by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers when projects have more than a minimal individual or cumulative impacts. If they're evaluated using additional environmental criteria and involve a more comprehensive public interest review. Now, those C-list 26, 27, and 28, and also D-list projects that qualify for an individual or standard permit, they require OEM consultation. And note that permits don't have to be obtained prior to approval of a Type 1 CE. Guidance on documenting analysis and coordination on wetland impacts is provided in Part 2, Chapter 9 of the PD&E Manual. Also refer to Part 1, Chapter 12 for more information on environmental permits. A U.S. Coast Guard bridge permit may be required if your project involves modification to or replacement of a bridge over navigable waters. Now, most maintenance projects on bridges in navigable waters of the U.S., they are exempt from the requirement of a bridge project. But to determine if navigable waters are present, you can use the AOI tool, which has a navigable waters layer, or other GIS layers and imagery as available. A field visit is recommended to verify whether the waterway is navigable. And just to let you know, those navigable waters are those waters that are subject to the ebb and flow of the tide and or are presently used or have been used in the past or may be susceptible for use to transport interstate or foreign commerce. Now, if a navigable water is identified, a bridge project questionnaire may be required or it may be requested to determine if a bridge permit is going to be needed. Now, if needed, a bridge project questionnaire is usually sent to the Coast Guard, or in the case of FDOT District 3, it's sent to the Federal Highway Administration for a determination. Now, if a bridge permit is required for a C-list 26, 27, or 28, or a D-list type project, then that same red warning label is going to appear when the box is checked and consultation with OEM is required. If prepared, the bridge development report and a bridge hydraulic report, they'll need to be uploaded into the SWEP project file. And guidance on documenting if a bridge permit is needed is provided in Part 1, Chapter 16 of the PD&E Manual. The presence of floodplains can be determined by reviewing the AOI tool. Other GIS layers from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, the city, the county, and local plans. FEMA's Flood Map Service Center can be used to download flood insurance rate map panels, flood insurance studies, maps, and other information. Now, the image here on the screen is an example of that interactive mapping tool on the Flood Map Service Center's website. If no floodplains are identified or there's no impact, you're going to check the first box. The second box is checked if there are floodplain impacts that qualify for uses that are functionally dependent or facilitate open space. Now, functionally dependent uses, those are those for which the project cannot perform its intended purpose unless it's located or carried out in close proximity to water. Examples include bridges and also wetland mitigation projects. The term facilitate open space use is intended to capture projects that do not lead to additional base floodplain development and are compatible with the restoration and preservation of natural and beneficial floodplain values. Examples of this would include things like recreational trails and bicycle and pedestrian paths. The last checkbox here is for any floodplain impact which cannot be classified as a functionally dependent or facilitate open space use. Now, if this box is chosen for one of those C26, 27, or 28 or a D-list project, then the red warning label is going to appear and OEM consultation is required. Now, for bridge projects, the bridge hydraulic reports uploaded into SWEP and can support a determination that the project will not affect existing flood heights or floodplain limits. A location hydraulic report is typically not required for Type 1 CE. And guidance on documenting analysis and coordination on floodplain impacts is provided in Part 2, Chapter 13 of the PD&E manual. In addition to the AOI tool, mapping tools are also available on the National Wild and Scenic Rivers System National Park Service's website. They help identify if there's a wild and scenic river in your project area. Now, when determining if a river is present, note that a river corridor includes the river and the adjacent area within a quarter mile of the banks. If a wild and scenic river is involved or in the project area, you're going to select the box with the name of the river. In this case, I selected the Loxahatchee. And in the comment box, summarize the results of coordination with OEM and the National Park Service. Identify that there will be no direct or adverse effects on the value for which that river segment was designated. Correspondence with the National Park Service should be added to the project file and swept. Now, for minor activities, a simple email from the National Park Service will suffice to document that there's no adverse effect. And guidance on documenting analysis and coordination on the wild and scenic river is provided in Part 2, Chapter 12 of the PD&E manual. A nationwide rivers inventory interactive map is available in addition to the AOI tool to determine if the action involves a river on the nationwide rivers inventory, or NRI. If a project is located in the vicinity of an NRI listed river, but the project's not going to affect it, then you'd identify the name of the river in the comment box and upload details, things such as mapping and any correspondence with OEM and the National Park Service to help support that decision. If the project may affect the NRI listed river, then the first step is going to be to determine if there will be an adverse effect on the natural, cultural, or recreational values of the river segment. If it's unclear whether the project will adversely affect a river segment, then the National Park Service can provide technical assistance. Now, if an NRI river will be affected, but the project's not going to have an adverse effect, in the comment box, include the name of the river and the details to support that it's not going to be adversely affected. And only proposed new construction or proposed expansion of existing developments will need to be considered in assessing impacts. For example, repaving an existing bridge over an NRI river segment is very unlikely to impact the river. If there is an adverse effect on the natural, cultural, or recreational values of the NRI river segment, then coordination with the National Park Service is required and that the project cannot continue as a Type 1 CE. Now, guidance on documenting analysis and coordination on NRI listed rivers is provided in Part 2, Chapter 12 of the PD&E manual. There are a variety of desktop tools that can be used to help identify the potential for the presence of protected species. The AOI tool provides U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service information for planning and consultation, listed species and critical habitat, as well as the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA's Essential Fish Habitat. NOAA Essential Fish Habitat Mapper is another really good tool. The discussion of state listed species is encouraged to assist with your permitting. Now, the Florida Natural Resources Inventory is another source to identify the state listed species, species identified in the State Imperiled Species Management Plan, and also federally listed species that have been documented in an area. These lists identify the species with the potential to occur in the general area. Also, a land use review should be performed to identify whether suitable habitat's present. And this can start as a desktop review of the land use maps and aerials. A field visit, of course, is recommended to confirm whether listed plants, wildlife, or habitat may be present. A qualified biologist should determine the likelihood of presence of protected species and the impact determination. Species keys, programmatic agreements, a technical memorandum, and also a natural resources evaluation may be used to support the determination. Now, FDOT, in coordination with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, developed a programmatic approach, a PA, to meet the requirements under the Endangered Species Act for minor transportation activities. The PA addresses routine maintenance and modernization activities where there are either no effects or minor effects to specific federally listed threatened and endangered species. The PA is limited to projects that are within the existing right-of-way. This PA covers 15 species that commonly occur across the state, and there's 27 activities that are covered under the PA. Use of the PA will require implementation of specified best management practices. And be sure to review the PA for additional details when using it for your Type 1 CE project. In addition, projects must be evaluated for the impacts to essential fish habitat, or EFH, which is defined as the waters and substrate that's necessary for fish to spawn, breed, feed, or grow to maturity. Now, Type 1 CEs may involve listed species and critical habitat, as long as you document that the project has no significant impacts. If the biologist determines that the project will have no effect, or if a species key is used, then consultation is not required. For projects that may affect listed species, critical habitat, or EFH, then you're going to need to consult with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or National Marine Fisheries Service as appropriate. And you're going to need to upload any concurrence letters. Coordination with OEM is needed if the project results in a may affect likely to adversely affect determination. And those C-list 26, 27, 28 projects or D-list projects cannot have a may affect likely to adversely affect determination and remain a Type 1 CE. Guidance on documenting analysis and coordination on protected species and habitat impacts is provided in Part 2, Chapter 16 of the PD&E manual, and information on EFH is in Part 2, Chapter 17. Now, Section 4F of the U.S. DOT Act requires FDOT projects to consider park and recreational lands, wildlife and waterfowl refuges, and also historic sites during transportation development. In addition to resources that are identified in that AOI tool, you can review local parks department maps and master plans for local public parks. And we will go over identifying historic sites here in the next section. If there are no Section 4F properties present, you're going to check the first box. If there are resources but there's no use within the meaning of Section 4F, you must document the basis for this determination in the comments box, or via the no use determination form using the Section 4F tool that's in SWEPT. Now, the basis for that document, it should document that there will be no acquisition of 4F property, permanent or temporary, no meaningful proximity impacts, no impacts to access or usage, and no temporary occupation. Now, the Section 4F no use determination form should be used if the determination is complex. There are numerous Section 4F exceptions and exemptions, which are listed in Part 2, Chapter 7 of the PD&E manual. Now, to use this checkbox, you must complete that Section 4F exceptions, exemptions determination form in SWEPT, along with concurrence from the official with jurisdiction, and it's sent to OEM for concurrence. If the Section 4F tool is also used for a de minimis determination. Now, a de minimis determination may apply if your project impacts a Section 4F resource, but those impacts are temporary, or if they're offset by project benefits or enhancements. Coordination with that official with jurisdiction is going to be needed to make this determination. To document a de minimis finding, you would use either the Section 4F de minimis determination for historic sites form or the Section 4F de minimis determination for parks, recreation areas, and wildlife or waterfowl refuges form. And there's going to need to be concurrence with the official with jurisdiction, and it's also sent to OEM for concurrence. If the project's determined to need a programmatic or individual Section 4F evaluation, then it can't proceed as a Type 1 CE. Guidance on documenting analysis and consultation on Section 4 impacts is provided in Part 2, Chapter 7 of the PD&E manual. Now, Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act requires federal agencies to consider impacts of historic and archaeological resources. Now, the process for compliance with Section 106 and also Chapter 267 of the Florida statute is also implemented through a programmatic agreement. And this agreement is among the Federal Highway Administration, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, the Florida Division of Historical Resources State Historic Preservation Officer, and the FDOT regarding implementation of the Federal Aid Highway Program in Florida. The Section 106 programmatic agreement may apply to a lot of different Type 1 CEs. The programmatic agreement specifies two primary considerations that govern the required level of effort for the cultural resources study and review, the project location in regard to the potential for cultural resources to be present in the area of the undertaking, and the specific activities that are associated with the development, construction, and scope of the project, and also their potential to affect cultural resources, should such resources be present. Now, regarding project location, some geographic areas are very unlikely to contain historic resources. Regarding the specific activities, some projects, they're just so minor in scope that unless the specific project corridor itself either contains or abuts or is a historic resource, then there's very little chance that the undertaking could affect historic properties. Now, many Type 1 CEs are considered minor project activities in the Section 106 Programmatic Agreement. This agreement defines two categories of minor project activities that typically have little or no potential to affect historic properties. The first group includes 6 project activity types that can be designated as no effect on historic properties, provided that they meet certain criteria, including being a standalone project and not being located on tribal land or on or adjacent to historic or archaeological resources, being 50 years or older or listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Now, examples include things like the installation of signs, replacement of lighting, and restoring existing pavement or bridges. And please consult Part 2, Chapter 8 of the PD&E manual for a full list of these. The second group includes 57 activity types, and it requires a desktop evaluation or also could require a field review in order to verify that the project has no potential to affect historic properties or to determine that additional efforts are needed to meet the requirements of historic preservation laws. And examples include things such as construction of bicycle and pedestrian paths, adding or lengthening of turn lanes, installation of ramp metering control devices, things like that. And please consult Part 2, Chapter 8 of the PD&E manual for the full list. Desktop tools to identify resources include the AOI tool and also the Florida Master Site File. And once identified, historic properties should then be reviewed in relation to design plans. Now, for either group of minor project activities, the State Historic Preservation Officer, called SHPO, and OEM must be notified of the no potential to affect or no effect finding and have not objected. If FDOT finds there is potential to affect a historic property, which could result in a determination of either no adverse effect, or adverse effect, then FDOT must consult with the SHPO to determine the next course of action. Now, if the determination is an adverse effect, then you must consult with OEM. And if it is one of those C26, C27, C28, or one of those D-list projects, and it's an adverse effect determination, then it's not going to meet the criteria to proceed as a Type 1 CE. Please note that tribes are not signatories to the 106 Programmatic Agreement, and if they're potentially interested, then you're going to need to send project information to OEM to submit to the tribe for review. If your project does not qualify for using the Section 106 Programmatic Agreement, you must still evaluate those cultural resources as appropriate. Review Part 2, Chapter 8 of the PD&E Manual for guidance on the level analysis and documentation that's going to be required. Now, supporting documentation for this topic may include a Cultural Resources Assessment Survey Report or Technical Memorandum, and that should be uploaded into SWEPT. Now, SHPO concurrence letters should also be included with the checklist if applicable. Most Type 1 CEs are going to qualify as what's called a Type 3 project for noise, and they do not require noise analysis. Now, Type 3 projects don't involve things like added capacity, construction of new through lanes or auxiliary lanes, except turn lanes, or substantial changes in the horizontal or vertical alignment of the roadway. Type 1 CEs that may require a noise analysis include adding auxiliary lanes and construction of things like new roundabouts or traffic circles. If noise analysis is required, identify if noise abatement is warranted on the checklist, and the noise study report should be uploaded to the project file. And guidance on documenting analysis and coordination on noise impact is provided in Part 2, Chapter 18 of the PD&E Manual. Documentation of contamination screening evaluation is required to demonstrate that contamination involvement in the project was considered and addressed as appropriate. For Type 1 CE, this documentation may include a Level 1 evaluation report, a technical memorandum, and also maybe coordination letters. A technical memorandum is prepared for those projects with no contamination impact or with minimal contamination involvement. To determine the level of contamination involvement, review those desktop sources, again, such as the AOI tool, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection or FDEP's Map Direct. FDEP has a contamination locator map and an institutional control registry. There's also a national priorities list, Superfund enterprise management system, and you can look at aerial imagery and also Oculus. And you're going to need to conduct field visits and interviews as necessary. Also provide a summary of findings in the comment box in the checklist and upload the Level 1 report or technical memorandum as appropriate in SWEPT. Guidance on documenting analysis and coordination on contamination is provided in Part 2, Chapter 20 of the PD&E Manual. Now, planning consistency for Type 1 CEs is met when the project is in the State Transportation Improvement Program, or STIP. Now, the relevant STIP page from the work program is included in the project file to document that the project has met the planning consistency requirement. Supporting documentation for Type 1 CEs is uploaded into the SWEPT project file. This documentation includes things such as maps, field reviews and notes, technical studies and memos. For example, you may have an impact summary memo as shown here, or the Cultural Resources Assessment Survey Report, or a natural resources evaluation, or even a community awareness plan. Records of agency coordination and consultation should also be maintained in that SWEPT project file, such as concurrence letters with SHPO or U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or National Marine Fisheries Service. Also correspondence that represents findings, any species effect determination keys or specific species survey protocol can be uploaded, and also including that planning consistency documentation. The Commitments module in Project Suite Enterprise Edition PSEE is FDOT's standard system to document, transmit, and track project commitments. And it distinguishes between environmental commitments from those other commitments made for the project. Commitments must be tracked using the system, and it's used to generate a project commitment record to save in the project file in SWEPT. And guidance on preparing and documenting environmental commitments is provided in Part 2, Chapter 22 of the PD&E manual. In SWEPT, after the checklist is completed, the green Send for Approval button becomes enabled. And once a Type 1 CE checklist has been approved by the District Environmental Manager or designee, it's going to be visible on the project page in SWEPT. After checklist approval, the environmental certification form is filled out and signed with a determination date by the District Environmental Office in SWEPT. This form is required for federal aid application. And you can view the SWEPT detailed Type 1 CE training for instructions to fill out this form, and also instructions on the Type 1 CE checklist at the link that's provided here on the screen. Now, before we begin our next lesson, let's go ahead and do another poll question.
All right, thank you, Christine. So we have poll question number 3, and let's pull it up. Okay, so which of the following must be included as a supporting documentation? Please select all that apply. We have public involvement summary report, alternative analysis, documentation of analysis to support findings, STIP sheets, and agency consultation determinations. I'll allow some time for people to submit their answers. Go ahead and give it another 10 seconds. All right, and closing. Let's take a look at the results. So correct answers were documentation of analysis to support findings at 91%, STIP sheets, which was pulled in at 58%, and agency consultation determinations at 90%. Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody. Back to you, Christine.
In our last lesson of the day, we're going to briefly go over reevaluations. When a project moves to another phase or it has design changes, you're going to review the Type 1 CE checklist to see if it remains valid. Reevaluations should be completed when changes have been made to the project that may affect environmental impacts. And note that design changes may include right-of-way changes, roadway or drainage, easements or temporary construction easements not previously known or previously identified. Reevaluations are also needed when existing conditions have changed since the completion and approval of the last Type 1 Categorical Exclusion checklist. They also should be completed if subsequent release of federal funds is required after a year has passed since the previous status of environmental certification for federal form project was submitted. In December of 2020, FDOT made a change in methodology, which allows previously approved Type 1 CEs to be reevaluated by reviewing all the previously approved information, making edits where necessary, and reevaluating reevaluating and reaffirming the previous approval. Now, the previous process required a new Type 1 CE form to be completed using the Type 1 CE checklist form in SWIFT. And now the SWIFT interactive forms for Type 1 CEs have been updated with functionality. It allows modifications to previously approved actions to be reevaluated, only updating those elements that are needed. Now, the new process, it became effective December 23rd in 2020, and reevaluations after this date, so all reevaluations going forward should use this new process. And the PD&E manual chapters will be updated to reflect these changes in the next revision of the manual. And now I believe we are ready for our last poll question.
All right, fourth and final poll question, launching it now. And it is a Type 1 CE reevaluation should be prepared. Reevaluation should be prepared. Select all that apply. All right, we'll go ahead and close it here in a few more seconds. Perfect, thank you. Okay. The results are a Type 1 CE reevaluation should be prepared for when a design change requires additional right-of-way and when existing conditions have changed. Perfect. Well, thank you so much for everyone's time. And I would like to go ahead and take this time to remind everybody to submit your questions in our question box, and we will answer them as time permits. So while we're kind of allowing time for everybody to think up and submit their questions, I'd be happy to read off some questions that we've already answered. But first question, if we meet conditions from multiple 23 CFR 771-117 C and D qualifiers, are we trying to support all qualifiers that we meet? And yes, you will select the C or D type that best fits your project, would be the appropriate way to address that. Let's see. We had a question come in regarding if there was any guidance for what qualifies as a C3 support facilities, which are not actually paths or lanes. So at this time, our answer would be to please contact our OEM or your district office to discuss the details of your project to determine whether a C3 is appropriate for your project. Let's see. Here was a great question regarding public involvement. What factors are considered when determining the level of public involvement required for a Type 1 CE? That's a great question. So for Type 1 CEs, a community awareness memorandum is prepared if the district determines that sensitive community issues exist on or near the proposed improvement. This can reduce the potential for conflict as the project advances through future project phases, design, construction, and maintenance.
Harrison?
Yeah.
I could also add on that too on the items that require a public hearing.
Mm-hmm.
If you'd like me to, a public hearing is going to be required for the project if it increases capacity, like the addition of new lanes, or if you're providing new access to a limited or controlled access facility, you know, things such as new interchanges, and also construction of a facility in a brand new location.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Christine. Then we had another question come in wanting to know if the checklist will be updated for wetland impacts to include FDEP 404 program permits. At this time, since the regulations only refer to the US ACE permit, we have not changed the form. However, if you have a project that requires an additional state 404, please coordinate with OEM before proceeding with the type 1. But then we had another good question regarding when a type 1 CE is being prepared for right-of-way surplus, what should be uploaded to the planning consistency section. In order to create a CE1 in SWEPT at all, the project FM must be in a work program. However, there are many instances where the CE1 is necessary to be supporting paperwork of the federal action. Section 11, providing planning consistency, is automatically added. Project description should highlight no funds, and the attachment can or should be the page from the tip stip, even if it doesn't show any money as it would be expected. And then someone had a question with not being familiar with the term project commitment and wanting to know what that would mean and what that indicates for them to do. So a commitment is an obligation to an external stakeholder to provide a feature, or a commitment is an obligation to perform an action related to a project that will be implemented in a future project phase. Please refer to Part 2, Chapter 22 for more details on environmental commitments. When we enter everything into SWEPT, have we met all NEPA requirements? Or is there a checklist or other document requiring further NEPA screening? That's a great question. The Type 1 CE needs to be approved by FDOT, so please contact the district to confirm requirements have been fulfilled. And then finally, we had a couple questions regarding any additional materials, or if there will be a link provided for when the recording is made available. So all attendees will receive a follow-up email with location of the recording once it becomes available. So if y'all have any more questions, please feel free to go ahead and submit them and we will answer them. All right, well, seeing no new questions coming in, I would like to thank everybody for your time and for coming and learning about the Type 1 CE process. And a big thank you to Christine. You did a fantastic job, and we are all very appreciative for your knowledge.